1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. In many ways, it is the most important book published in the last 200 years. But at first glance, one would hardly have expected this about an eminently readable but unglamorous text which discusses giant tortoises, finches, and gooseberries. Nevertheless, Darwin's The Origin of the Species rocked the foundations of the Western tradition. Indeed, as the American philosopher John Dewey has put it in an essay he wrote in 1909 titled The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy, The Origin of the Species introduced a mode of thinking that transformed the entire logic of knowledge, morals, philosophy, and religion in the West. In the same way that the mathematics of Pythagoras, as Professor Staloff earlier described them in his lecture on the Pre-Socratics, had influenced Plato, and in the similar manner to the way in which the revolutionary of the physics of Sir Isaac Newton was to have influenced Immanuel Kant, so too Darwin's legacy is to be found in the works of subsequent philosophers, and as we will see in subsequent lectures, especially in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and William James, though of course in the works of many others as well. In the course of this lecture, I wish to address 5 points. First, I'll say a few brief words about Darwin's life. Secondly, I would like to introduce a discussion of the importance of The Origin of the Species as an intellectual undertaking. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about the argument of The Origin of the Species and Darwin's 1871 book, The Descent of Man, in some detail. Fourth, I will speak about some of the philosophical consequences of Darwinism, and I'll say only a few brief words here. That will get played out in subsequent lectures today and tomorrow. Fifth and lastly, I would like to say a few words on the fallout of Darwin for the theory of politics, for political theory in the West, especially his influence on 19th and early 20th century political thinkers. The Origin of the Species originated in Darwin's love of nature. His grandfather had been a famous naturalist, his father had been a physician, and his father had hoped that his son might follow in his footsteps and become a medical doctor, or if not a medical doctor, perhaps then a minister. But Darwin had followed his own bliss and enrolled at Cambridge University to study biology and the natural sciences. It was at Cambridge then, in 1831, that Darwin was offered the opportunity to take up travel around the world on the HMS Beagle as its naturalist. The Beagle was a British surveying ship that was going around the southern hemisphere to make a survey of the world. Darwin was invited along to take notes on the flora and the fauna which the ship encountered. And it was as a result of his study, a result of his meticulous notes and drawings from this venture. I think we're all aware of the famous discussions that Darwin made about the giant Galapagos turtles, about the small variations in the beak structure of finches which he encountered on his travels. Having taken these notes in the course of his 5-year journey of over 40,000 miles, Darwin then returned to England and began to construct his argument. It took him a number of years, and finally, as I say, in 1859, he published his results. He offers us then, in The Origin of the Species, an argument about the origin of life on the planet. But what makes an understanding of Darwin so important? After all, we've seen that other peoples have been able to make arguments about the origin of life. The ancient Greeks had their view, a view that Ouranos and Gaia had come together and so created the world. The ancient Babylonians' cosmogenic view was that Tiamat and Marduk had worked things out in an original creation. And the Judeo-Christian tradition itself has offered an argument that about 6,000 years ago, in 6 days, as is told in the book of Genesis, God created all things, each according to their kind. What makes, then, Darwin's account different? What makes it worth discussing and examining Darwin in some detail? It is his mounting of empirical scientific evidence. By listening to Darwin, we will get a sense of what it is that scientists do. And after all, it is science today that is increasingly displacing philosophical discourse in our culture. We will come to understand what it means to be scientifically minded and to construct a scientific argument. I think we're all familiar with the basic argument of the origin of the species. All life, Darwin says, is the result of an evolutionary process which began millions and millions of years ago. Biologists today tell us that it was about 3.6 billion years ago that life first evolved. It evolved, Darwin tells us, from a randomly conjoining collection of molecules on the planet. A random conjunction, if you will, of certain carbon, oxygen, and potassium molecules. This random combination in the booming and buzzing turbulence of the original ancient primordial flux simply randomly generated a chemical structure which had the curious effect of being able to replicate its chemical structure by drawing on, if you will, the soup of inorganic chemicals that surrounded it. We saw then with this first, what Darwin calls protocellular life form, the creation of a thing we had not seen before, life on the planet. Darwin's theory of evolution, furthermore, articulated not just this notion of evolution. After all, his grandfather, the naturalist, had himself actually written poetry about the possibility of some sort of an evolution of the species. But it is with Darwin's articulation of the mechanism by which the process of evolution occurred, that is to say, the mechanism of chance variation or random variation in the offspring of species, that makes his argument so compelling. Why indeed, then, is it important to study Darwin's argument? It is important because with Darwin, we are, as it were, present at the writing of the modern book of Genesis. We are present at the writing of a creation story put down not by the hand of God, but by the hands of scientific men. The argument of the book is simple and elegant. To follow Darwin, we need only agree with David Hume's claim that we ought, as human beings do best, to follow the proportion of the evidence presented to us. To Darwin, the evidence is conclusive. He begins the origin of the species on a simple point familiar to his fellow Englishmen, familiar, I think, to most of us, the idea of domestic animal breeding. He says, the process by which evolution has occurred in the course of history has been by subtle variations and manipulations over time of the genetic process of animals. If he's talking in those terms at that time in England, I think would have been sort of confusing to people, disorienting, and so he offers us the example of the horse breeder. Familiar to all Englishmen, familiar to all of us, I think, is the idea that a horse breeder, in order to achieve a faster horse, mates swift stallions with fast mares. Subtly altering the genetic structure, they are able to succeed in achieving quicker racehorses, as the pragmatic result of winning money at the track. But under nature, there aren't horse breeders around. And so the question arises, how is it then that this process of evolution occurs in a state of nature? Variations of all sorts, Darwin says, variations of all sorts occur when animals breed. Each successive set of progeny differs in small ways from their parents, of course. Our children differ ever so subtly from ourselves. Darwin believed that the subtle variations from parents to offspring was the result of a genetic averaging of the two parents. The subsequent work, or actually the work which had already been done, which Darwin was unaware of at the time that he wrote Origin of the Species, by Gregor Mendel. Mendel's work was done in the mid-19th century, but was not really discovered until the year 1900, suggests the notion today that we hold of dominant and recessive genes. Darwin had it ever so slightly wrong in his argument then, in the claim that it was an averaging of the genetic structure, rather than simply one dominant gene prevailing over a recessive gene. But by and large, he had it effectively right. That is to say, there are slight variations in the species from parents to offspring. Indeed, those slight variations are often much more significant than they usually are. The mechanism of natural selection occurs when we have, for reasons, whatever they might be, perhaps radiation from the sky, perhaps a simple breaking off, we would say today, of a chromosome from the proper place it has in the order of the cell, in the zygote. We have then vast mutations, sometimes in species. And Darwin's point is that some of these mutations are valuable to a particular animal. That sometimes we get fishes with longer tails that ever so slightly, in little ways, are able to beat out their fellow offspring for the food supply. They therefore are able to reproduce in greater numbers. They therefore are able to pass on their genetic mutations, their genetic traits. This process of competition for nutrition among the species is extremely important. There's also, though, an importance in the development of sexual selection, as Darwin talks about it. That is to say, animals must reproduce, and insofar as they reproduce, they have to be able to find a mate. The process then of sexual selection, as Darwin spoke about it, was the process of males of various species fighting it out with other males for the domination of females, or, as he says also sometimes, the choosing of the females in various species of the most beautiful mate. He uses, for example, the argument about the peacock. Traditionally, the view that peacocks, with their extremely beautiful plumage, had been that they had been created by God in their beauty as part of the absolute gorgeous beauty in the world. Darwin argues instead that the beautiful feathered plumage of the peacock is not the result of some grand design by God. Rather, it is the working out over time of an aspect of the male peacock so that he will become increasingly, as Darwin puts it, attractive to the peahens. Peahens, and here Darwin speaks somewhat anthropomorphically, he uses human characteristics, or that is to say, he implies certain human characteristics in animals time and again when he discusses sexual selection. The females are attracted, as it were, or select out because of the handsomeness or beauty, he often writes, of certain male counterparts. The peacock's beautiful plumage, then, is used to attract a sexual mate. It is part, not of a grand design, but simply of the working out of evolution. So too with instincts. Those animals possessed of aggressive instincts are able to fight off others in the course of evolution. Aggressiveness is selected out in the course of the evolutionary process because it has the advantage that it allows those animals possessed of it to fight off others and to survive. So too with lust. Animals with persistent sexual urges are the ones likely to have the greatest number of progeny and therefore pass on that trait to their successive children. But Darwin says that there's even more than this that we have inherited instinctually. he argues that even the trait of social sympathy has been naturally selected in the course of evolution. Those animals which have protected their young succeed in having a greater survival rate than those who abandon them. This notion of social sympathy, he says, we find in monkeys as well as in men. Monkeys will adopt the orphaned offspring of their fellows, just as we as human beings do. Hence, natural selection has selected out both instinctual and physical traits. And not only instinct, but consciousness too. Think about this. Intelligence itself is nothing other than an accident of evolution. It's not that we've tapped into some transcendental good. It's not that we're a chip off the old block of the transcendental Godhead. It is merely the fact that the more animals that act behavioralistically with what we call greater intelligence, those with the capacity to remember what a dangerous situation is, to recall it, and to act perhaps aggressively, or to fight, or perhaps to flee successfully from that situation, those are the sorts of animals that are most likely to survive. Indeed, the Harvard naturalist Stephen Jay Gould has made the point that if we could go back several hundreds of millions of years ago to the time of the Burgess Shale and sort of mess things about. The Burgess Shale is an extremely important time geologists have focused on recently in a description of the process of natural selection. If we could go back to that ancient time and sort of just kill off, sort of stick our finger in a pool of water at just the right moment and sort of swat down, killing off one aspect of one particular mutation, utterly random, completely by chance, but stop that particular lineage, none of us would be here today. In fact, consciousness, human consciousness, animal consciousness, might have been able to be obliterated by some random process of selection millions of years ago. It is only by chance that we are here today. What evidence then does Darwin give for these claims? I think many of us are familiar with this, but I would still like to recapitulate it for those of us unfamiliar. Darwin points to three sorts of fundamental evidence. He points to the geological fossil record, to the evidence of embryology, and to the evidence of comparative anatomy in building his case. First, the geological fossil record. The fossil record is a major element which supports Darwin's claim that life has mutated out of the primordial slime in the course of history. He argues life has become more and more complex. As we go back in time further and further into the chain of ancient rocks, we find evidence for what Darwin calls the slow and successive appearance of new species. That is to say, I think it's a point familiar to most of us. If we go back in geological time by looking at older and older and older rock formations, when we go back, as it were, 3.6 billion years ago, to find the most rudimentary life forms extant. That is to say, protocellular or perhaps barely cellular life forms. If we wait then in geological time for 3 billion years, we will begin to see in the fossil record multicellular life. That is to say, for the first 3 billion years of evolution, a process which scientists today tell us has taken about 3.6 billion years. For the first 3 billion of those years, there was only single-cellular life on the planet, only single-celled life on the planet. At about 500 million years ago, give or take, we begin to pick up in the fossil record multicellular life forms, which have, of course, evolved from simple amoebas to more complex vertebrate and invertebrate animals. We can trace out then, through the various morphologies in this fossil record, the lineages which have led to walruses, the lineages which have led to the development of the seal, the lineage which has led to the development of the elephant, etc. Darwin notes, of course, that many people object to his claim that this fossil record is clear evidence of the process of natural selection over time, the process of evolution, because they say, hey, look, the fossil record is incomplete. There are gaps in the record. In The Origin of the Species, he argues not to worry. It's merely the result of the poorness of the paleontological collection and not a fault with the general theory that we don't have every single species that has ever evolved. The second sort of evidence that Charles Darwin points to is that of anatomical similarity. This point is pretty clear, I think. He says cats and dogs came out of the same more or less lineage, came out more or less of the same lineage. They both have 4 legs, a head, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. They have a rough, gross anatomical similarity. So too, we human beings share a lineage going back perhaps 6, perhaps 8 million years when the human species broke off in the chain of evolution. Perhaps chain would not be the best word in the sense that it's not a chain in the sense that there's every single link is important. That is to say, sometimes links break off and die out, species become extinct, but I think as a working metaphor, it works fairly well. In the course of evolution, in the chain of evolution, if you will, then, human beings evolved out from the other major primates about 6 or 8 million years ago. The debate rages as to exactly when that happened. We have then similar anatomical forms with chimpanzees, baboons, and orangutans. And in the course of his writing, Charles Darwin offers us some very nice passages in his text where he compares the ear of the human being to the ear of the orangutan, where he compares the folds and fissures in the human brain with the folds and fissures in the orangutan. I don't want to belabor this point. I think it's clear. In gross anatomical terms, we, human beings and other animals, share, it appears, a common lineage. Another sort of evidence, and an evidence which surprised me as an undergraduate when I came on it, is the similarity in embryological development. And I think for those of you who are familiar with this, it's not a surprise, but I was taken quite aback when I saw the claim in Darwin's text, in his Descent of Man, that the fetus of the dog, after a period of about a week's development, looks virtually identical with the fetus of a human being. That is to say, ontogeny Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, as Darwin puts it. What does he mean by ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? He means that we each, as individuals, recapitulate the entire process of evolution in our own persons. When the 2 cells came together at the point at which you were conceived, they began the multicellular development. Within several hours, you had gills and a tail, just like tadpoles and fishes, forms much earlier in the process of evolution. You developed thereafter into a fetal structure that looked an awful lot like the fetal structure of the dog at a certain point. Of course, the process of human gestation is 9 months, and eventually, after a period of several months, the human fetus takes on a very different characteristic than do the other animals. But we can see then, in this embryological historical process, that it is the fact, Darwin says, that the embryological evidence points to the fact that we as human beings share a common ancestry with fishes and dogs and all other life forms. In this way, then, Darwin brings together paleontological evidence, that is to say, the evidence of the fossil record, anatomical evidence, and embryological evidence in his claim that all living things have evolved from a single protocellular life form. In his 1859 Origin of the Species, Darwin was pretty careful to avoid a discussion of human beings. But 12 years later, in 1871, he published The Descent of Man, in which he carries out the implications, the logical implications of his theory of evolution for human beings. We are, as I've said, like other animals, descendants from the primordial slime. Indeed, as Darwin put it, we are, I think he wrote, descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped, probably arboreal in its nature. We are, he concluded, the origin of the species, undoubtedly descended from barbarians. In The Descent of Man, he points to a great deal of evidence about the similarities of human beings and other primates in the effort to show our common heritage. In the effort to describe the similarity of the nervous system of human beings, Darwin points to the evidence of the habits of many animals. And he looks, for example, at the habits of the baboon. In northern Africa, the baboons, he said, we find have a taste for coffee and tea and for beer. And the baboons in northern Africa are often caught by their hunters, by the hunters exposing large tubs of beer. The baboons, in Darwin's example, the baboons find the beer, drink it, and get falling down drunk. And it's easy enough then for their captors to collect their prey. In fact, Darwin goes on to say that when we observe the habits of the baboons on the following morning, we find them grimacing, grabbing their heads, and when offered more beer, turning away in disgust. He says that this humorous example points to the similarity of tastes which human beings and which beasts have, and it belies a similar structure in their nervous systems. We, as human beings, Darwin says in a moving passage in the text, differ not in kind, but only in degree from other animals. We are not so much a monkey's uncle as we are a monkey's cousin. We ought, Darwin says, frankly admit the common community of descent between human beings and other primates. Indeed, that most sacrosanct idea, reason, Darwin says, is not something which has descended to us from God, but is rather itself a process of the evolution of the species. Animals, he points out, are possessed of various forms of instrumental reason, even if they don't have complex languages. And he cites the example of monkeys who will, in order to get at the core fruit in an orange, bash the orange on a tree trunk, and having learned this behavior, remember it and reasonably use their brain to engage in similar behavior in the future. Indeed, in a neglected passage in the text, Darwin discusses human morality, intelligence, and instinct. And he says that all human morality, not only reason and intelligence, can be traced back to the social sympathy, which is the result of an instinctual process selected out in the course of evolution. Our feelings of sympathy and of love for our fellow men are the result of natural selection. Our moral codes, which philosophers for millennia had derived from some transcendental claim, from some vast logical dissertation, Darwin argues, are merely adaptive instincts. Our ethical codes, he says, are nothing other than modified instinctual impulses. I'd like to turn now briefly to some of the philosophical consequences of Darwinism. I think most of these are probably fairly transparent to us, but I think they're worth articulating. In a world that is the result of natural selection by chance mutation, we have to jettison, Darwin says explicitly, in both The Origin of the Species and in The Descent of Man, the idea that the world has been designed by a creator, that it has been planned and predestined by God. The Origin of the Species brought man's genesis down from the heavens. We move in our discussion of human beings from the cosmic to the organic. The high culture no longer focuses on supernatural election, but rather it finds its grounding in natural selection. The intellectual weight of the tradition of the last 2,000 years of discussion about revealed religion and the importance of the Bible in terms of understanding our origins and our importance in the world are shattered by Darwin's claims. He repeatedly asserts in his texts that his scientific theory makes untenable the popularly held view that the story in Genesis is the way the world was created. Darwin's theory led to a reinterpretation of the cosmology dominant for 2 millennia in the West. His theory, when added to his friend Sir Charles Lyell's earlier 19th century discoverer of a vast geological time, contradicts the teachings of the Bible. Acceptance of Darwin's views makes a literal interpretation of Scripture impossible. Indeed, if we think about the human soul, Darwin's philosophy, I should say Darwin's science, has important implications for our notions of the philosophy of soul. The English philosopher, the British philosopher, Sir Lord Russell, made note of the fact that if we are the result of random mutations over time, if we are the result of random variations in the structure of the planet, in the structure of living organisms, then the idea that at one moment, on a particular day, uniquely, God created the fishes as fishes, the birds as birds, and at that special moment created men and women in his own image and breathed a soul into them at that moment. That view, Russell says, is untenable. Given Darwin's notion of evolution, where would it be that the soul would have been placed inside of us? With Java Man? With Cro-Magnon Man? At what point in this evolutionary process was the sacred soul supposed to be invested in us? Sir Lord Russell says, Darwin's view makes this notion of the immortality of the soul merely laughable. I'd like to turn now then to some brief comments about Darwin's evolutionary theory and its effects on politics. The theory of social Darwinism, which grew up, actually had its beginnings prior to Darwin's writing of The Origin of the Species, but grew up and became especially popular in the aftermath of Darwin's writing. The notion of social Darwinism, especially the works of Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, are especially interesting to look at in the light of Darwin's theory. Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner sought to scientize libertarianism. That is to say, they sought to offer a scientific argument for how it is that we ought to abandon the importance of the power state. By taking up various parts of Darwin's claims, Spencer fashioned a defense of the view that there should be only the survival of the fittest. Only the fittest should survive, Herbert Spencer wrote. In fact, actually, he wrote and communicated and talked with Charles Darwin about this, and Darwin, although he does not include the phrase the survival of the fittest in his earliest versions of The Origin of the Species, does in subsequent versions actually incorporate the phrase survival of the fittest into his text. So Herbert Spencer influenced Darwin as well as Darwin influencing Spencer. The notion which social Darwinists, and especially Herbert Spencer, hold is that civil society is the natural state of things. That is to say, government should remain neutral in our lives. Government is not natural on their view. And it leads, they argued, to a continued existence of the weak in our species. The social Darwinist's argument is this. Look, what happens when a sow has a runt in her litter? She eats it. And what happens when a mutational baby chick is born? The mother hen pecks it to death. What happens when wolves go out on the hunt? Do they wait around for their fellow weak, injured, old, and incapable wolves? No. But what do we as human beings do in our society? We place the weak in our society in safe harbors. We use the accumulated wealth, the surplus value of our society, through the state to continue the process of allowing the weak to survive. Spencer thinks this is a terrible mistake. He asks us actually to jettison our traditional Judeo-Christian views of love for others and to look at things in terms of the rude but real, in his opinion, notion of evolution. In fact, in a wonderful footnote in an essay he wrote called "The Sins of Legislators," Spencer detailed the evil results of the welfare state. He tells the story of a woman he names Margaret in upstate New York. And Margaret, he says, had over 200 descendants in the course of a number of generations. Margaret herself, he notes, had been weak, indolent, lazy, and unintelligent. But she had been supported by the government. She had been allowed to have a number of children, which were in turn also supported by the state. Spencer's point is that if you look, he says, at her descendants, at the over 200 descendants which eventually were the result of her own existence, her being allowed to continue by the welfare state, that every one of her 200 descendants were themselves also charges of the state. Some were in prison, some in insane asylums, others simply on welfare rolls. He traces this problem then to the problem of genetics. He says, look, we ought treat our species like other animals treat their offspring, right? Rather than nurturing and allowing people like Margaret to live, we should kill them before they multiply. In this way, we ensure that we will not, in several generations, come up with an entire species of dollards and lunatics. Spencer, it seems to me, is mistaken on a number of counts. First, his claim that only the fittest ought to survive is merely a tautology. That is, if we absent the state and allow competition for scarce resources, then those who survive will be declared the fittest. But their survival tells us nothing else about them than that they have survived. Secondly, Spencer has misrepresented Charles Darwin, I think. Darwin describes a process wherein species are successful, as Darwin puts it, in proportion to the number of progeny which they have. In proportion, they are successful in proportion to the number of offspring which they're able to successfully generate. That's what it means to be successful in a purely scientific Darwinian sense. Darwin hasn't placed any moral judgments on the survival or extinction of any species. Indeed, if anything, Darwin had pointed to altruism and social sympathy as themselves being the result of instinctual traits selected out in the process of evolution. Spencer's claim then that it was the aggressive nature of human beings that somehow ought to outdistance our altruistic notions of love seems to me a misreading of Darwin's texts. Thirdly, Spencer wishes to insist that the state or the government is not, as I said before, a natural part of the struggle for existence. Here, however, there were a number of immediate challengers in the 19th century to this view. I think especially important is the work of Lester Ward. Herbert Spencer had published in 1852 a book which he titled Social Statics, and which had articulated many of the views I've ascribed to him here. Lester Ward, self-consciously, had written in response a book which he titled Social Dynamics, and in which he argued that the power state, the activist state, could be an effective agent in assisting people to survive. Fourthly, and perhaps most compelling for us today, we do not hold the view, as Spencer did, that indolence and poverty are the fault of an individual. Instead, we have increasingly, in the wake of social Darwinism, developed the view that human beings are more or less the same, that it is their environment and not their genetic coding which makes them poor. And so, our modern social theories look to the manipulation of social environments in order to influence social behavior. Hence, modern liberals have broken with the Spencerian arguments that the state ought not be invoked. They have argued instead that the activist state can be a useful tool if intelligently controlled, a tool which will result in social progress.